Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc. I'm here today with Yoni Appelbaum, who is at The Atlantic magazine, deputy executive editor at The Atlantic, and also the author of this book right here called Stuck: How the Privileged and the Propertied Broke the Engine of American Opportunity. Welcome, Yoni.
I'm glad to be with you.
So, look, this book is about a topic that has fascinated me for a while, which is the decline in mobility here in the United States. And so you cite some statistics going back to the 19th century where I think it was about a third of Americans moved every year. And now we're down to about a 12th. And like you, I moved a lot. I just had to, after reading the book, I had to go through and count the number of residences that I've had in my lifetime. And it came to 40. So I've had 40. Yeah. And I can totally relate to moving day. So when I was in college at the University of Pennsylvania, September 1st was moving day. And I would typically rent a U-Haul and have to get up like 5 a.m. to get the U-Haul. And then we would move about 8 different people with that U-Haul. So it was a pretty laborious day. And so chronicling this, you explain, provide a number of different reasons for this. But one question is, are we just becoming like other countries? Because, you know, other countries have never had the kind of mobility that the U.S. had. U.S. was kind of a unique place. And so in some sense, we're just kind of regressing back to what would be normality for most countries, right?
Yeah, I think that's entirely possible, that we went through a period of youth and adolescence. And as we mature as a society, we're just not going to relocate the way we once did. And although that's possible, I think most Americans are not prepared to accept the corollaries of that choice. There were things that we got out of moving all the time, things that I think many Americans think of as intrinsic to being American, that if we're not going to have those levels of physical geographic mobility within our society, we're not going to have those things either. And I think that's the trade-off I want people to focus on.
Right. And I think there's a strong degree of correlation between geographic mobility and economic mobility, right? I mean, I'm here in the Bay Area and, you know, it's astonishing to me that I can't find, you know, people to work for me, right? And people outside the Bay Area are astonished that they can't find a place to live. So maybe before we get into the causes, maybe can we rule out some of the causes? Because some people would say, oh, it's just a product of aging, right? People are getting older. Or maybe it's just a product of, I don't know, a desire to own property. And so it's easier to own property now. And so, you know, home ownership is a good thing. We want people to be settled down. Some people would point to the rise of 2-income households, which make people, you know, less capable of getting up and moving. So to what extent are these driven by what we might think of as economic or demographic forces, as opposed to, say, policy interventions?
Yeah, it's a great question. And to some extent, obviously, they are driven by demographic changes that have a real impact. The problem is that the sharp decline in mobility has really taken place over the last 50 years or so. Starting in the early 1970s, we still were moving, 1 out of 5 Americans was moving every year. And now the latest numbers are 1 out of 13. So that's a pretty sharp decline. It's happened fairly steadily over the last 50 years. It's happened across any demographic subgroup you want to look at. And so if this was being driven by the aging of the population, you would expect the young people would still be moving at something close to the old rates, but it's the opposite. Young people have shown a particularly steep decline in their mobility. So it's not just the aging of the population. If it was 2-income households, you'd expect them to be less mobile than other households. And in fact, it's the opposite. 2-income households typically have the kind of affluence that still enables Americans to move. They're not down more sharply than other households, just the other way around. That doesn't mean that moving is easy for 2-income households. It doesn't mean that moving is easy for people who are later in life. It does mean that if you're looking for a cause, you look around and you say, okay, you know, how well does this hypothesis match the observed fact? And although in each of those groups mobility is down, none of those explanations can account for the extraordinarily large, long-term, and broad-based decline in American mobility. And in fact, where that decline is concentrated points in the opposite direction.
Well, look, what's so great about mobility? Because I know a lot of people would say that, mobility leads to enemy, right? It erodes social ties. It dissolves any kind of sense of community, right? And in fact, people from outside of the U.S., that's one thing that they point to, and they say, yeah, back in, my hometown in Europe, right? I get to see the same people that I've seen, throughout my life. I mean, to what extent is that a myth?
Yeah, I think it's actually mostly the other way around. But let's start here. In any decade you want to look at, from the colonial era to the present, the people who have moved have done better economically than the people who stayed behind. Their kids do much better than the people who stayed behind, right? So mobility clearly yields economic gains. But the question is, does it come at a social cost, right? Because we've all had the experience, or most of us had the experience of moving away, losing friends, having to say goodbye to loved ones. But let's go to the example you started the show with. The 4 years you spent at the University of Pennsylvania, were you lonely, isolated, without friends, and without social activities over the course of those 4 years?
Not at all.
Right. And I think usually.
But now I don't know my neighbors.
Right. Yeah. If you ask somebody, like, what was the best social period of your life? When were you likeliest to make new friends? When did you form the lasting relationships? When did you get involved in lots of different activities? Most Americans who have the luck to attend a 4-year residential university will tell you that's when it was for them. And that's not coincidence. A 4-year college, when you arrive freshman week, like, you are arriving in the last place in America with really high levels of geographic mobility. That campus does what small towns and cities across America used to do for their residents. You're arriving there. You're surrounded by other people who are also starting over. You have the impetus. Loneliness is good. Aloneness is bad. But loneliness is like hunger. It's a spur to action. You're arriving there. You can do the uncomfortable work of reaching out, of trying new things, of joining clubs. It's awkward to walk into a meeting for the first time and not know anyone in the room. You do that when you don't really have a choice. If it's your first Sunday in town, maybe you go to church, not that you've been in years, but you need to meet people. Maybe you talk to the person sitting next to you at the bar. So it's that loneliness of the new arrivals in town that has traditionally spurred people to form social relationships. You're much likelier to join something if you're new in town. And then there's the other part of it too, which is that a community that's full of new arrivals will have a much more vibrant civic life. Our voluntary associations have been much more active in decades when Americans are moving around at high rates than in the decades that they're not. And the last 50 years, as we've stopped moving, have also seen the sudden atrophy and decay of our civic and social life, which was once the envy of the world.
Yeah, a lot of people talk about how Americans are the most trusting of people. And I think even if you go back to de Tocqueville, right? I mean, he talked about this rich civic life. I mean, I guess they didn't have Kiwanis and Rotaries, back in the 19th century. But it does seem like bowling alone has happened since we've started to settle down, right? And if you go to Europe and you go to South American places where, they brag about their constancy, I mean, you tend to see these compounds, right? Everybody has like walls around their houses, and they have these, cliques and clans that they spend time with, and they don't really mix outside of those long storied relationships.
Yeah, that was the greatest blessing of mobility. In most times and places around the world, everything that mattered about you was defined at your birth. You inherited your spot in the social hierarchy, your religion, often your father's occupation, your prospects, your identity. All of that was largely, and your geographic location, right? You lived on the land your family had lived on for generations, and where you expected your grandkids and your great grandkids to live. You were defined at birth. What America did by allowing people to choose their own communities, by giving a legal right, and this was a bit of a legal revolution, the chance for people to move where they wanted to, we gave people the chance to decide who they wanted to be, through their physical geography, through those serial relocations, because Americans didn't just move once, maybe not 40 times. You may have that up on a lot of us, Greg, but by moving repeatedly through their lives, Americans were able to continually reinvent themselves and to fashion their own identities. All of these things became matters of choice. America, for 200 years, has been the only country on earth where a majority of adults don't belong to the church into which they were born, or the faith or religion into which they were born. They switch, right? You arrive in a new place. Maybe you grew up a Methodist, but there's a Baptist church right down the street. You try that one. This is a matter of self-fashioning, and that, I think, is something that is quintessentially American. The idea that each of us should have the chance to choose who we want to be, and it is inextricably tied to that kind of remarkable level of geographic mobility.
Now, is this largely a class phenomenon? Because I think for most people in the educated elites, right, such as, I guess, you and me, right? I mean, it's largely invisible because, I mean, I've been, Philadelphia and then, Durham, North Carolina and Charlottesville and Arlington and Cambridge and Berkeley and all the people that I hang out with have moved, right? They're all college educated people who, are academics and they're bouncing around wherever the jobs are. And I don't know anybody, right, in my circles who is from Berkeley. So, I mean, is this trend something that is largely invisible to the wealthy and the educated because they're continuing to move at rates that are similar to what they had 100 years ago?
I think it is. I think that this is a remarkable, profound shift in the country, and one that's largely passed unremarked. For one thing, it decayed slowly. There wasn't a sudden rupture. But more importantly, as you say, Americans with postgraduate degrees are the last ones who really exercise the traditional rates of mobility. That's not how it used to work, interestingly. It was the broad middle that used to move the most. People who had enough resources to be able to try someplace new, but not such extraordinary prosperity that they wouldn't want to start over. And that has really eroded in America. Many of our compatriots grow up with a sort of inchoate sense that there was a promise that was extended to them that was not fulfilled, that they ought to have had more control over their own destinies, that they should have been able to pursue opportunities. They may not know it's because they never relocated from the communities in which they were born. But empirically, that seems to be the case, that the further down the income ladder you go these days, the less likely people are to move, and that there's a highly mobile elite that continues to enjoy all of the opportunities that geographic relocation confers on people, and then the vast majority of the American population, which is stuck in place.
Yeah, but I think immigrants are the exception, right? Because I mean, they're continuing to move, and they're the ones that actually have, I guess, the biggest upward mobility, right? Because they don't get stuck or tethered to quite the same degree that native-born people do.
Yeah. Immigrants actually, I think, really drive home this point. We all know that story of America as a land of golden opportunity, right? The reason that immigrants thrive in this country is 100% of them are migrants, right? Definitionally, they've all relocated from one place. They've all had that experience of starting over. And they will naturally congregate in the places with the greatest economic opportunity. If you're coming here, you tend to follow relatives or friends from the same village or acquaintances who have found jobs and can help hook you up with a job. It's really interesting. There's a great study that matches native-born Americans against immigrants to see, why do immigrant kids succeed? And it looks at, is it because their parents stress the value of education? Do they have a better work ethic? It looks at all these different factors, and it finds out that pretty much 100% of the difference between how immigrant kids and how the kids of native-born Americans fare is geography. If you match native-born American kids who move to the same cities at the same times as those immigrant kids, they do just as well in life. What the secret to immigrant success in America is geography. They're still moving to the places that offer opportunity, and then their kids are getting the benefit of that advantage.
Well, I mean, obviously there are barriers to moving into the areas that are attractive, but are there things that are kind of holding people back? Are there gravity considerations culturally or socially that prevent people from, getting up and leaving? I mean, when you look at, for instance, the Okies, the Okies would just get up and go back when their harvest was wiped out by drought, right? When we look at the people in Ohio and Michigan, right, who have experienced similar devastation to their towns because of loss of industrial jobs. I mean, a lot of them stay put. And so, obviously part of it has to do with the cost of moving, but is there something else? Is there something keeping that? I mean, look, if you stayed in Oklahoma in the 1930s, you basically starved to death, because they didn't have any social support. Is the social support that we provide, the safety net in some way, creating some frictions?
Yeah, I think there's no question the safety net creates some friction, but I don't think it's the whole story. When I was writing the book, I went and spent a lot of time in Flint, Michigan, because I thought it was a great place to try to answer exactly the question that you're posing. There's a great opportunity atlas put together by some researchers at Harvard, that looks at census zones and tries to figure out sort of how do kids do who have grown up in these different places. So I went to places that were in the first percentile. That is, a kid born there, of 100 places in America, this place was the worst place to be born. It was the worst place to grow up in terms of adult outcomes. I wanted to know, like, if you're a parent living in that zone, in a place where, your kids are in the first percentile for opportunity, why are you still there? Why are you raising your kids in a place where, people aren't stupid. They know that they're screwed. They know that they're deprived of opportunity. And what I found was really interesting, because if you ask people, why are you still here? The first thing that you get is a whole series of answers that have always been true of people who are contemplating moving. They say, well, my family's here. I'm very involved in my church. It gives me a real community. I've always lived in this place. I love this place. You could get those same answers from somebody living in Western Massachusetts in 1780 and somebody living in Ohio in 1820. And right, there's always been high friction to moving. But then if you ask the question a different way, if you say, have you ever left Flint? Suddenly you get a whole different set of stories. People would tell me, well, yeah, my cousin got a job down in Miami and I went down there and crashed in his apartment and I got a job. And I thought I was going to make it, but then he lost his job. He couldn't pay the rent anymore. So I had to move back. And I got versions of that story over and over, that people had actually often tried to leave Flint. They could see the downsides. They were pulled by the opportunities elsewhere. But over and over again, the thing that kept them in Flint was that they could afford to live in Flint, and they could not afford to live in the places that offered them better jobs, that offered their kids better prospects. So I think really, we got to focus in on how weird that is, that for almost all of American history, when a place was thriving economically, we threw up new housing to accommodate all the new arrivals who would flock toward that opportunity. And then 50 years ago, we pretty much made it impossible to do that. And so as a result, when people are in a place today with declining opportunity, they really are kind of stuck, that the places that they could move just can't accommodate them.
Now, these areas of opportunity, no one who lives there, or very few people who live there, will come right out and say, yeah, we don't want anybody coming into our neighborhood. We don't want the unwashed. We don't want the mob. We don't want the vulgar people. They'll never say that. But that actually was something that people would say, right? Not only in Europe, but even in early America. So you referenced this kind of golden age where when people would move to a new town, everyone would greet them and welcome them, give them little kits. I mean, that didn't seem to be the norm, right, for most of our history. I mean, it seems like even in the early colonial times, even though we had this frontier, these towns, these corporations were very restrictive about who would get to live in the towns themselves, right?
Yeah, the golden age was there in terms of the ability of Americans to move places into fashion communities. Communities were never entirely welcoming of the new arrivals, and often outright bigoted about it, and sometimes violently so. So, migration in America, because it's so powerful, because it's what really shapes your outcome in life, has always been fiercely, fiercely contested. And if you want to understand just how important it has been to American life, you just look back at that history of contestation. So yeah, in the early colonial era, towns, you didn't have a right to move someplace. Like if you wanted to move to Berkeley, you wouldn't have been able to buy a house and move in. Your neighbors had the right to warn you out. The town was going to be responsible for your upkeep if you ever fell on hard times, and they could deliver a notice to your door that said, we do not accept you as a resident, in essence. And if you tried to stick it out, they could have the town sergeant bind you up and put you in a cart and take you back to the town that you belonged to, because everybody belonged to some place. In legal terms, there was a place where they were legally resident, and they didn't have the right to shift their residence unless a new community accepted them. That's the way the world worked. And that was the remarkable legal revolution that Americans have. That they say, okay, we're going to let you legally move anywhere. But then it got very fiercely contested very quickly as Americans flood into places that offer a lot of opportunity. There is this real pushback. And that, in fact, is where we get zoning, which is developed as a legal tool that can pass constitutional muster to exclude people you don't want to have in town.
Yeah, I mean, these towns back in the day, I mean, they're almost like co-ops, right? Or condo associations, right? The cities, the municipalities, where, if you weren't a shareholder, then you really had no business there. And it's funny that we don't even have the right to mobility in the Constitution. It took a while before there was actually some kind of affirmative declaration on the part of the Supreme Court to, affirm people's right to move as, vagrants or impoverished people. I find it amazing that came so late.
It's amazingly late. It's in the Articles of Confederation. And so its omission from the Constitution is probably purposeful. It went hand in hand with this older system in which you belonged to a particular place. It's not until the Okies, actually. It's not until World War II when an Okie tries to move to California, and California actually at this point sends cops to the state border to try to keep him out, and they arrest a man for bringing in his brother-in-law and try him. And the Supreme Court looks at this in the context by then of wartime production and says, this is insane. We can't allow states to not let the population move toward war industries. But there's also this thing that has happened by then. Americans often sort of invent their own constitutional rights that get written back into the text. And it's clear, reading the various opinions in that case, that the justices all believe that there is a fundamental American right to live where you want. And the only thing they can't agree on is sort of which clause to read that right back into. But there's nobody on the court who says, states should really have the right to only admit who they want. So by then, although it's never formally recognized, something profound has shifted in the country. And there's sort of a universal acknowledgement that people within the country ought to be able to live where they want to live.
So look, if you couldn't legally ban someone from moving into a particular neighborhood, you got to find some other method. And you talk about the history of zoning, Euclidean zoning. But Euclidean zoning, I mean, it does have racist origins, right? Exclusionary origins.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time trying to excavate the history of this because I wasn't satisfied with the accounts that were out there. In the first known instance of zoning in America that is enshrined in law and upheld is in Modesto, California, where the Chinese of Modesto have gone into the laundry business because it's pretty much the only business that is allowed for them to pursue. And the respectable white citizens of Modesto don't want them there. And they try a number of things to get rid of the Chinese. The first thing they try is vigilante violence. They put on hoods and march through Chinatown, smashing and burning things, beating up a cop who tries to interfere. But the Chinese want their ability to pursue the American dream, and they rebuild. And the second thing they try is arson. They try burning down the laundries and forcing them out of town. And again, they rebuild. And then they take a really extreme measure. They pass America's first zoning ordinance. And that succeeds where violence has failed because they pass a law which does not mention the Chinese, does not say that it is racist. It simply says that all laundries have to relocate west of the tracks and south of G Street. And I pulled a contemporary map of Modesto and was able to find that there was only one settled block at the time that matched that description. And that block was labeled Chinatown. This was a ghetto ordinance. It said that the only job that you can pursue can only be pursued in a racial ghetto. But because it did not spell out its racist intent, it was upheld by the courts.
Well, I mean, it seems like there's two different types of zoning. I mean, there's land use zoning, which separates out industrial from residential. But then there's the other type of zoning, which within residential, you are requiring some minimum plot size or, minimum value, right? And it seems like the former, I mean, there are a lot of arguments you could make for industrial use zoning that are built on common law of nuisance, right?
Right. So this is the really interesting thing that zoning does. It's not that land use was unregulated before zoning comes along, but it was all built on this common law of nuisance, this idea that if you're harming your neighbor, that the law can restrain your ability to do so. But the thing was, you had to demonstrate a harm. If your neighbor paints their house lavender, that may be offensive to your soul, but it is not a legal nuisance. It's not a harm. You haven't been actually hurt in any way. But that there was this gray area. A lot of people didn't like having apartments in their neighborhood. They didn't like having, a single family home get leased out to boarders who could use the spare bedrooms. These things weren't nuisances in a legal sense. And regulating them was going to fall along a really different line, because under nuisance law, it was always a question of what are you adjacent to, who's actually being harmed. Zoning, for the first time, said there are things that are perfectly fine, but they're perfectly fine in one place and they're not fine in another. And that was a new kind of logic, because the Supreme Court said, there are some things that are, it's like a pig in the parlor and not in the barnyard. It's a proper thing in an improper place. But if you follow that logic, you're essentially saying some of our residential neighborhoods get to be parlors, and some of you have to go live in the barnyard. Once you allow things to be done by zone rather than by harm, what you're saying is some of you will live under one set of rules and some will live under an entirely different set of rules. So it's not like you can't have the tannery next to a residence, which applies everywhere. It's the apartments all have to go on that side of the tracks, which applies only some places. And so that was the real innovation of zoning. And at the time it's proposed, every lawyer who's involved in the movement forthrightly acknowledges that it is unconstitutional. They know this. They admit it. They write about it. They all understand that they are in the process of changing the understanding. And there's a loophole, which is that if the practice is seen as a usual practice by the time it gets to the Supreme Court, then it could be a legitimate exercise of what they call the police power, the municipal regulatory authority. And so they try to spread it across the country as fast as they possibly can. And sure enough, a decade later, when it gets up to the Supreme Court, the court looks at this and says, we just walk to work through a city that is zoned. Our neighborhoods are zoned. We're going to allow this because it is now a usual practice. So it's this total legal revolution.
Yeah, and there were these evangelists of zoning who were going around the country, right, offering like a how-to, right, to the local leaders. And this also is tied up with the Garden City movement, right? And what you call tenantophobia, right? So tenementophobia. So, I didn't realize that there was such animosity against apartments. We all know about Jacob Riis and the photos. And I think to this day, if you ask someone about tenements on the Lower East Side, everybody would say that they were places of filth and violence and disease and uncleanliness and, fostering bad habits and morals. And was that all just propaganda?
Mostly. It is going to sound a little crazy, but it was mostly propaganda. Jacob Riis and other reformers of the era deliberately went and documented the very worst cases they could find, almost all of which were buildings that were converted from some prior use into residential use. And some of those cases were really bad indeed. It's not to say that there weren't people living in squalid and abject poverty. But the fundamental problem there was the squalid and abject poverty, not the buildings. And many of the reforms that they pushed through, and the reformers were forthright about this, were actually intended to make it unaffordable for immigrants to live in their city. What they were trying to do was to raise the cost of constructing new apartments so high that people would stop building them and then immigrants would stop coming. And sometimes they'd confess this. There's this amazing conference proceeding I found where the guy who headed the tenement reform movement explains that apartments are too popular to ban by vote, but he's found a great solution. He just calls every regulation fire safety. And then he says, what we want to do is lard on all the fire safety regulations on the apartments, but be careful not to put them on the 1 or 2 family homes because we don't want to make those too expensive to live in. It wasn't about fire safety. It was about trying to jack up the price too high. And so the hatred for apartments was really profound. It's almost hard to recapture the mentality, but the people who wrote about them in those years, not only did they sort of associate them with immigrants speaking foreign languages, eating strange foods, practicing weird religions, with everything they sort of hated about immigration, they actually thought they corrupted character. There's, Teddy Roosevelt sort of endorses an exhibition in which somebody speculates that, within a few generations, eugenically, an apartment, only like the worst and basest people could possibly survive apartment life. And so within a few generations, you sort of breed a subspecies of human that would be inherently degraded. They thought that they would lower your morals and breed violence and vice. And I mean, it's sort of amazing these days to look at the buildings that they thought were so inherently degrading. I went back to the tenement my great-grandfather had lived in on the Lower East Side, which was one of the buildings singled out by the reformers as inherently degrading, as impossible to live in with good morals. It is impossible to live in. If I wanted to rent his apartment, it would cost me $7,200 a month.
Right.
And so, it turned out that once you put in the cherry wood floor and the brushed steel appliances, like the whole thing, takes on a different cast. There was nothing wrong with the buildings, but the reformers sort of targeted them as a way to exclude populations they found undesirable.
Yeah, I mean, I think you still see this today in cities like San Francisco, where right-meaning progressive people will say, oh my gosh, you can't be allowed to build a place that is that crappy, right? But I mean, you can't live in a place. I mean, anybody who goes to, an Ivy League school lives in a dorm that is smaller than the places that are illegal to build in cities like San Francisco. I mean, why is it okay to have people live in tents, but it's not okay for them to live in what might be, dense housing or relatively small units?
Yeah, that turns out to be the trade-off, right? If you're not getting rid of poverty, if you're only getting rid of the kind of housing that people without a lot of money can afford, what you do is one of a few things, right? Either the people who remain in the city are forced to live on the street, and homelessness is a rising crisis in this country, driven by our regulating the kinds of places that people with limited income used to live in out of existence, or they remain where they are. I think a lot about a great study, which shows that, if you were a janitor in Alabama 50 years ago, or a lawyer in Alabama, and you moved to San Francisco, your income would go up by about 70%. Your housing expenses would go up by a lot less than that. And so you were, every couple of weeks, you were putting a larger chunk of change into the bank when your paycheck cleared. You were getting ahead. And not only that, but like your kid was going to a better school and they were likely to do better in life. If that janitor in Alabama, and maybe you were switching jobs, right? Because there were different kinds of jobs available in the Bay Area, and maybe you didn't have to be a janitor. But even if you just did a janitor, you do much better off. If that small town lawyer in Alabama moves to San Francisco today, the gains are just as large in percentage terms. He'll still do that much better, and his housing expenses will not eat up his income. He'll end up just a little bit better off, not doing as dramatically better as he would have done a couple generations ago, but still doing somewhat better. For the janitor, it's a really different story. That janitor's income will still go up by 70%, but their housing costs will go up by way more than that. It will more than erase the gains. At the end of every 2 weeks, he'll end up with less in his bank account. And so he's not moving at all. If you don't build housing that is affordable, if you don't build new luxury housing that rich people move into, thereby letting the older housing stock become available to people on more limited incomes, if you're not building, then you're shutting out those people. And so it's not just the crisis of homelessness, which is a real crisis. It's also that lack of mobility. It's that janitor in Alabama who makes the rational decision and says, hey, I'm staying in Alabama. There is nothing for me in San Francisco. And they're right.
Now, all of this new construction that happened during the industrialization and urbanization of the 19th century and early 20th century, this is all private development, right? I mean, block upon block upon block of housing in West Philadelphia or South Side of Chicago. I mean, this was all done privately, and some of the stuff was quite nice, some of it was pretty rudimentary, but you could make money building mansions and you could make money building sheds, right?
People made a lot of money building really mediocre housing for people who wanted it, and the market. The market worked in some ways, right? So markets are tricky. They need to be regulated. They need to be, fine-tuned to serve public ends. I'm not a free market fundamentalist, but in the 19th and early 20th century, one of the things the markets did pretty darn well was they supplied large amounts of housing in places where there were jobs, because people would move to those places. They would get jobs that paid them enough to afford housing. And then entrepreneurs would step in. And one of the really interesting things about the housing industry was it was particularly a meritocracy. People went into real estate development when they were excluded from other lines of work. You can see this in the Jewish real estate developers of New York is a great example of this. They couldn't get hired at the law firms. They couldn't get hired at the good hospitals. Other kinds of learned professions often excluded them entirely. But if they could scrape together a stake of capital from their friends and neighbors for that first loan on the first building, they could parlay that over and over into new real estate development and build up their capital over time. And so the real estate industry has traditionally been an immigrant industry in this country. It's been an industry where people who lack social connections, who face exclusion or discrimination, have been able to build up their own businesses and supply usually their own communities with the housing that those communities need. That was the historic American housing story.
Yeah, it's kind of astonishing. One of the fun facts in your book is that Berkeley, the city I live in, has the same number of residents now as it did 100 years ago. And I live in a 100-year-old house, and like, the neighborhood hasn't changed really at all in like 100 years in terms of density. And so part of this is zoning, of course. Part of it is building codes. But part of it also is this push for home ownership, right, that you talk about, going back to the post-war period and the FHA and so forth.
Yeah, there's some of this is like very deliberate federal policy where the single family home is seen as sort of this instrument of virtue, that if you can get these unwashed immigrant families into single family homes, you can make good, respectable Americans of them. And so that's part of the federal policy here. And part of it is inadvertent. The federal government gets into the housing business. This is a little bit technical, but bear with me, because there's a mortgage crisis and it's taking down all the banks. And so the thing the federal government really sets out to do in the New Deal era is to stabilize the banks. And it can't do that if people are walking away from their mortgages. So it's got to find a way to make it attractive for people to hang on to the houses they already own. A mortgage at that point was maybe half the value of the house. And it would be a 3, a 5, maybe a 7-year instrument. And so you're usually just paying the interest on it for a few years. And then you could roll it over and take out a new mortgage on the property, or you could pay it off if you'd accrued enough. But what people were looking at, they're like, look, my monthly payment is more than renting the house down the block that was just foreclosed. Why wouldn't I default on my mortgage, rent for less than I'm paying? That the house isn't worth that much anyway. All my equity's been wiped out. And so they were walking away because it was the rational economic thing to do. So the federal government says the only way to keep people in homes is to extend the term of the loan, stretch it so far that we can bring the monthly payment for a mortgage to be cheaper than the monthly rental on the equivalent house. And thus is born the 30-year mortgage that many of us pay today. It's not that the federal government sits there and thinks, a 30-year mortgage, that would be really socially desirable. This is a good idea. It was just a question of how far you had to stretch it in order to keep people from defaulting. And they lower the down payments again so that people could get a good economic incentive to stay in the homes that they don't stop defaulting on them. And so you get the 20% down payment of a 30-year mortgage, and it opens up home ownership to a much larger swath of Americans, as do things like the Montgomery GI Bill. But it's not really, the federal government does want to encourage home ownership, but a lot of our housing policy is like a lot of federal policies, right? It's sort of an accident of history. And what it does is something that nobody really anticipates or thinks through. It strongly incentivizes Americans to stay in place.
Yeah. And of course, the mortgage deduction, right, is another thing that makes it difficult for you to, right, go back to being a renter. And of course, in California, we have all sorts of other things like, Prop 13 that add some frictions into moving and to selling your house, right?
Yeah, we've often tuned our policies to advantage homeowners. And I think there are good reasons for this. One is that people who are homeowners, who are on average much older, more affluent than other people within their communities, are much more likely to vote in municipal elections. They're much more likely to vote in state elections. And so
But
you
I
get
mean,
policies.
that could be a bad thing because, as you point out, the ones that go out and vote in these municipal elections are basically voting to keep people out, right?
Right. No, but that's exactly it, is that historically our policies have often been tuned to advantage their interests because they're the ones who vote for the politicians who are making the policies. And so we come up with things like the mortgage interest deduction, like Prop 13 in California, which sort of freezes your taxes at the moment you buy the property. All of these things are intended to reward incumbent homeowners, but nobody's stepping back and saying, wait a second, maybe the golden goose in America is residential mobility. Maybe if we pass these policies, we are going to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs. That awareness is not there. You don't see people discussing it in those terms. You don't see any policymaker thinking like, what are the offsetting harms of this? If I allow people to stay in their home for longer, does that come at a social cost? What does that do to the people who didn't yet get the chance to live in a place which had good jobs? Am I shutting them out of these communities? Those discussions don't happen. And so a lot of these changes happen because policymakers are trying to serve the political interests of long-term residents of their communities and are not thinking about that broader state or national picture.
But it seems like there's also a cultural element, right? So when we hear from people, young people, they say, oh, I can't even afford to buy a house. I have to rent. It's like, well, so what? Like, what's wrong with renting, right? Is people look down on renters? I mean, it seems like even if we didn't have an economic advantage, there is ostracism of renters.
One of my favorite stories in the book, which measures, I think, how far the culture has shifted, is about moving day, this sort of annual event in most cities and towns where all the unwritten leases would expire on the same day. And a quarter or half the population would get up and switch residences between sundown and sunup. And there's this old lady who's not moving that year, who draws all the curtains of her home and shuts the door so that everybody will think she's moved out and she won't be embarrassed by the fact that she was staying in place, right? Like that's when we were a migratory culture. There was sort of a strong belief that moving toward opportunity was something that you did if you could. And as we've turned into a sedentary culture, now it's the, I got to go rent a new apartment. That's vaguely embarrassing.
Well, even though, the wealthy people lived in hotels, right? I think, when Herbert Hoover, who talked about how, if you live among other people, it's going to be bad for your morals. He spent the last, 30 years of his life in a hotel.
Yeah, in what amounted to sort of a luxury apartment rental. And
which if it were an actual property, they probably wouldn't be able to build it and sell it, right? Because it was too small.
Right. No, you get into these real ironies. Many of the reformers, in fact, who are decrying tenements live in apartments themselves. They're passing policies that they don't intend to abide by. That's a very American story too.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to dig into the current problems because it seems like the support nowadays for zoning and so forth comes not from the racists and the folks who are explicitly trying to preserve their property values, but rather those folks who are trying to, preserve the look and feel of their neighborhood. Environmentalists are the big supporters of these restrictive building codes, and historic preservation folks are the ones that are making it difficult for you to build new stuff, right? So, but these key people are normally thought of as progressive, and I think they might be surprised to find themselves in bed with a legacy of racism and elitism.
Yeah, if you go to enough zoning hearings, you will hear people say remarkably racist things. So it's not that nobody ever articulates it these days, but you're 100% right that a lot of the opposition these days is done on exactly those grounds. And the first thing to say about that is that some of that is right. There are real trade-offs. Right. So, if you wanted to build an apartment building next to my house, I would be concerned about the parking. I'd be concerned about the fact that there's some green space next to my house that would be entirely covered. I'd be concerned about, the changing character of the community and the fact that it's a wonderful historic neighborhood that's being altered. And I know all of this because somebody just built a big apartment building next to my house. I had those concerns, but but there are offsetting social goods that come out of allowing new people to move into your neighborhood too. I think there is a profound change in American culture that happened in the 1970s when Americans turn against growth. Up until then, the presumption was that if your community grew, you would do better and those around you would do better, and that growth was a positive social good. And there were really good reasons why in the 1970s, Americans suddenly get very skeptical of this. They've been watching 20 years of urban renewal ram highways through minority and impoverished neighborhoods. They've been watching, the Cuyahoga River light on fire and rampant pollution need to be addressed. That they are skeptical the government is really going to safeguard the public interest. They see big business and big government as being in cahoots. And you get an ideology coming out of the 60s and 70s, which says you can't trust the government. The only way to get good outcomes is to empower ordinary citizens to champion the environment, to champion history, to champion the local, and to empower them to effectively veto government decisions. And with land use, every decision is a government decision, right? Like once you have zoning, the ability to build anything anywhere is subject to government approval. And so what we get is the political left turns against the ability of government to do things and instead decides to err on the side of allowing people to veto whatever it is that somebody tries to do. That will stop a lot of genuinely harmful things. And it does, right? Urban renewal grinds to a halt. The environment gets cleaned up. But there is a cost to stopping everything. And I think that's what you're pointing to, is that people will use these rationales to stop not only really negative things from happening in their neighborhood and really negative changes, but also use them to stop what I think are really positive changes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, here in Berkeley, it's sort of the epicenter of some of these things, right? And I belong to the Berkeley Architectural Historical Association. I've got my house on the landmark registry and so forth. But it seems like, more apartments, more people, more residents means more restaurants. It means, more maybe nightclubs, more things to do, right? It seems like it would lead to a much more interesting and exciting and vibrant community. I mean, do you think people are just, I don't know, biased towards the negative? They're just not aware. They're not thinking about the benefits that could come from greater density and I mean, for God's sake, the wealthy people have to pay an enormous amount. They can't find people to rake their leaves. They can't find. Right. Don't they want to have these people close at hand and so forth?
You just used an important word there, which is community. I think as long as the conversation is about buildings, if you ask me like, hey, there's this beautiful house, it's 100 years old. Somebody wants to demolish it and make way for a 6-story building. Is that good? I would think like, no, it's a beautiful house. It's 100 years old, right? As long as you're talking about the buildings, you're focused on the potential harms of change. I think if instead and there's good polling on this. If you ask most Americans, like, should we build a new apartment in your community? They'll say no. That's not something they'll support. But if you ask them the same question in a different way, if you say, do you think that your children should have the chance to live in the community where they grew up? Do you think that the nurses and the daycare workers and the firefighters who serve your community should be able to live in the community that they serve? Do you want your community to be diverse in terms of income and ethnicity and background? Overwhelmingly, Americans will answer yes to all of those questions. And those yeses point in a very different policy direction, right? So if you make the fight about buildings, all people are naturally change averse, and they will see the loss as the familiar physical environment that they love is altered. And then 10 years later, if you propose tearing down that 6-story apartment building, they'll say, no, that's been here for 10 years. It's a vital part of our neighborhood, right? Like we all grow used to the things we have and are uncomfortable with change. But if you talk to them, instead of talking to them about the buildings, about the community, you get a really different answer. And I think nothing dramatizes that more than these communities that were built in the late 19th, early 20th century, where if you preserve the buildings, if you're walking down, if you're in Brooklyn or San Francisco or Philadelphia, and you walk down a row of 19th century townhouses, probably the store at the end of the corner is shuttered. And it shuttered because those townhouses will, on average, house only about a third as many people as they used to hold. Americans are used to having much more space than we used to have. We expect it. If you freeze the physical environment where it was 100 years ago, you are actually, it's like a silent plague wiping out 2/3 of the community. But if you're focused on the community, if you're like, look, there were 10,000 people living here 100 years ago, I want there to be 10,000 people today, then suddenly, if you're actually trying to preserve community, it requires you to alter the built environment. So I think that we often conflate these two things. People will say, I'm trying to preserve my community and its character, but what they're really doing is preserving the physical structures, the shells, not the living things within the shells. And if they focus on preserving the community itself, that actually requires continuing to build.
Well, so how do you think this might reverse itself? I mean, there is this movement, the YIMBYs, right, who are supposed to taking on the NIMBYs, and you see them at some of these hearings. But it seems like that is going to be a difficult push, right? Just because the interest that you have once you get a house in preserving its value is probably going to make it, difficult to do any kind of major reform. Do we need to take the power out of the municipalities and put it at a higher level, or do the courts need to kind of step back in? Because the courts were the main agents of stimulating the mobility, right? They were the ones that got rid of the restrictive covenants. They were the ones that got rid of the, poor law like regulations. I mean, do the courts need to step in here? I mean, we have rent control here in Berkeley, which is absolutely devastating to housing availability. I mean, no one in their right mind would ever decide to be a landlord in Berkeley. If you own a property and you rent it, you're considered not much different from a kulak in, Soviet Russia. And so it's no mystery why there's no housing here. But when state of Massachusetts got rid of rent control, right, over the objections of the voters in Cambridge and Somerville, that freed up a lot of housing. It seemed to increase property values. It seemed to have a beneficial effect. Do we need to have state level rules which would restrict the municipalities? I mean, of course, in California, we also have, I guess it's what, SB 5. Is that what it is? Or SB 9, I forget what rule it is for ADUs.
Yeah.
Is that the solution?
I mean, there's a lot of solutions that you just threw out there, right? Like trying to tune municipal regulation for the creation of new housing, authorizing things like accessory dwelling units that can be built on people's property. But the fundamental one, and I'm a bit of a Madisonian on this, right? Madison believed in creating a government for men, not angels. I think if you're asking a community to prioritize the interests of the people who are not yet members of that community, that's a big ask. And one of the things that really impressed me while researching the book, looking at hundreds of years of history on this land, is the extent to which communities over time, again and again, prioritize the interests of their long-term incumbent members. So the question is not, do we empower communities or do we restrict communities? The question is, how do we define our community? If we live in a national community, if we live in state-level communities, that requires mobility. Then you're thinking about the people who are in small towns or burnt out industrial cities where they don't have a lot of prospects in life, and you're trying to give them a chance to live someplace else. If you think of a community as much more circumscribed, I'm thinking about just my neighborhood, or I'm thinking about just my own municipality, then that leads toward exclusion and toward mounting American inequality. Which is the direction we've been pointed in over the last 50 years, as we've given municipalities more and more tools to restrict the ability of people to move in. So yeah, I do think there's a big role for state level governments. And that role is, I would think of it as a role in establishing basic equity. I think communities ought to be playing with the same rule book, that to allow a very affluent community to come up with 100 different zoning designations that are impossibly difficult to navigate and effectively make it impossible to build, while a less affluent community bears the brunt of new development. That there's something fundamentally inequitable in that. America is not the only country to be struggling with these things. There are other models. And in other places, often the same rules apply over a whole jurisdiction. And so if you had a state which said, look, here are the 10 zoning designations, local communities can apply these 10 designations however they want, but the most restrictive zoning designation still allows for street front retail. It still allows for 2-family homes. You can't go below that. Everybody's going to play by the same rule book. Nobody is allowed to have a neighborhood that is single family only. I think if you did that, Americans could probably get behind it. It's much, much harder to do these things at the local level, because if you do it only at the local level, everybody's like, what, over there, they still have the single family zoning, and that's where everybody's going to flee. But if you really make this equitable, if you ask communities to all play by the same set of rules, that's something that Americans tend to find pretty appealing. And they don't like the fact that the most affluent get to play by a different set of rules than they have to play by.
Yeah, I mean, here in the state of California, we have, we're probably the only state, I think, that has a prohibition on non-competes. And this has led to a, very fluid labor market. So, it's very easy to move jobs, much more easier to move jobs than to move residencies. Maybe, the state needs to, take a position on this and, make it into a state where people can move into and move around. And that makes me wonder, what is the role of employers here, right? Because, employers in these booming areas, they have a tough time recruiting people and getting them to move into the neighborhood. Why aren't they doing more to lobby for removal of some of these restrictions?
In California, they are now. But it's taken a while. And I think that a lot of that speaks to the reshaping of the global economy. 100 years ago, if you were a pharmacist or if you were a factory owner, you believed that your own economic fortunes, your own prospects, were intimately bound up with the prospects of the community in which you resided. And so you would push for that community to be a community that was committed to continued growth, to economic development. If you were a pharmacist and suddenly your town went from 1,000 people to 5,000 people, that was a lot more customers for you. If you're the Walgreens manager, it matters not a whit. Right? Like you get the same salary, whether there's 1,000 or 5,000. And so as we've seen waves of corporate consolidation, as businesses tend to serve global markets and not local markets, I think we saw a real shift in the way that the business community thought about the places where it resided. The prospects of individual business owners and managers were much less bound up in local prosperity. If they couldn't recruit a good enough workforce for the place where they were, they could always relocate. We've reached the limits of that. Throughout the country now, we have a housing affordability crisis. It's not so easy to go someplace where the labor is cheap, and particularly in a knowledge economy, it's not desirable. You actually want to be where the labor is skilled. And that makes it a lot harder. Now, all of a sudden, you can't run away from housing problems. And I think that employers are belatedly waking up to the fact that, once again, the prospects of some of the country's most successful companies are bound up not just in sales trends in China, that they're bound up in housing prices in Silicon Valley.
And what about the real estate developers? I mean, it seems like they would also have an interest in promoting right development. I mean, obviously, if you are a real estate owner, you have mixed feelings about this, depending on whether you have stopped building or whether you're continuing to build. But it would seem like they would have some influence. I mean, they seem to be vilified by a lot of these folks over history, right? They're seen as, I don't know, real estate developers aren't seen as people who are actually solving problems and contributing to the growth of the communities. They're seen as
and I think that on the whole, that's really unfortunate, particularly because, often, as I said, real estate development has been an immigrant business with people serving their own communities. Look, if I was going to place a bet, I would be very willing to wager on the greed of real estate developers. I think that's a very safe bet. And it's a bet I think we should be making as a society. That is, there are a lot of social problems that are really hard to solve, where we have to come up with, enormous levels of government investment and figure out ways to persuade people to do things they really don't want to be doing. The nice thing about the housing crunch is that there's a whole cadre of developers out there just waiting for the chance to make a buck. So mostly a question of listing restraint rather than it is one of incentivizing action. And those are much easier problems to solve. I think the real estate developers do want to get in on this. Many of them have grown so accustomed to a landscape in which building is really hard that they've sort of adapted to it and adapted to our collective costs. So this is an industry where developers tend to target their new developments where regulation is light as opposed to where people really want to live. They tend to look around for sites that are unlikely to arouse opposition as opposed to sites that are located near transit and near jobs. That they tend sometimes to specialize in their ability to navigate cumbersome regulatory processes rather than their ability to deliver high quality housing at low costs, right? Like you can come up with the best home design in the world and have the most skilled technicians, but if you're not good at persuading zoning review boards, it will not avail you. And so, they're sort of specialized in the wrong skills. And this is a sector that really has not shown significant productivity gains in 50 years. And there are good reasons for that. And so, yeah, I would like to see developers advocate a little more, but I think it's important to recognize that a lot of the existing developers have come to specialize in navigating a dysfunctional system. And what I really want to do is see a system that allows people with an entrepreneurial bent to get into real estate development. It'd be really fun if the kind of person right now who might, start an app development company says, what I really want to do is build houses. I've got a terrific, innovative way to erect multifamily housing at half the cost and half the time. That kind of entrepreneurship is not really welcome in the housing sector right now. Because if you can, what you're going to discover is that there's 3,012 rules that prohibit you from doing it. And so if you can fix the regulatory problems, you can open it up to that kind of entrepreneurial development again.
Well, look, last question. One economist you didn't mention in the book is Thibault, right? And he has this famous model which argues decentralization and localization is actually fantastic. And it leads to optimal public goods provision because all these different localities are competing basically for migrants, right? Trying to make the place as attractive as possible for people to move into. We don't seem to see that. And it's kind of a bit of a mystery, not just for new communities, but also existing communities. So, we look at a city like Oakland, which is, not a lot of people moving there. One would think that, a city like that would say, okay, we're going to carve out a niche here, right? We're going to try to attract a ton of investment by, getting rid of all this zoning. Why doesn't decentralization lead to competition for migrants?
It's a great question. And I think it's particularly an acute question because for most of American history, it did. You had these civic boosters who would advertise for their cities, who would, compete to lure businesses, to lure developers. And so, the best explanation I have is cultural. That as voters turn against growth, start to see it as a threat. There's a great study done by some University of Chicago psychologists that looks at people who want to move and then follows up with them later to see whether or not they managed to relocate. And the people who moved start to display a set of what I think of as characteristic American attributes. They grow more optimistic, more future-oriented. They start to see their own successes bound up in the success of others around them. And they grow more invested in their communities. And the people who wanted to move and couldn't, they grow more cynical, more alienated, and more zero-sum in their thinking. They detach from the communities around them, and they start to see that the gains of others come at their expense. Well, if you have a nation where a lot of the voters see new arrivals as likely to displace them, and are not wrong, because if you're not building housing, that's exactly what new arrivals will do. Then I think, most municipalities are going to be governed by people who are smart, who understand who votes, and who are risk averse. And you end up, instead of the kind of healthy and constructive competition that we had for the 19th and half the 20th century among municipalities competing to grow more, you end up with a really strong risk aversion, a fear of growth, that kind of cynical, alienated zero-sum thinking, which has come to predominate. But the nice thing about what you're pointing to is that this isn't a problem we need to solve nationally all at once. it's the kind of thing where, to the extent that there are cities, and there are some now, that are opening themselves up for building, that are trying to lure businesses and residents, that see growth as a positive, they'll start out competing the other ones, and people will notice. And so I do think that this is ultimately, although the book is a story of decline, it ends on an optimistic note. We're seeing a generational change as younger voters grow more friendly toward growth because they can see that they don't have the opportunities their parents had. And we're seeing a set of local changes that can snowball pretty quickly into a national change as some cities start out competing others.
Well, Yoni, thank you so much for joining me. The book is called Stuck. Check it out. It really does, in a very short book, encapsulate the entire history of zoning, mobility, and restrictions on that mobility. Thanks so much.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.